So let me introduce our first talk of the day. This is from Ross Otto. He's I think now a tenured professor at the Department of Psychology at McGill University in Montreal. And he did, I guess he did his PhD with Bradley Love and Art Markman at UT Austin, and then did some postdoctoral work with Nathaniel Dahl and I guess back when he was in NYU, and has been working a lot in cognitive effort, and I think sort of pushing that into sort of new domains. And today he's going to talk to us about some work on sort of social norms and communication of social norms. And yeah, I'll give you the floor, Ross.
Yeah, thanks for the intro. So to try to keep this brief, I think people have things they want to do. So I actually have to cut and run after my talk, get back to Montreal. But yeah, so this is work done by Shen Zhang, who was a visiting PhD student from Beijing Normal, who hung around my lab for a year and did a couple of really cool experiments in my view. So I can tell you about them today. And this is also in collaboration with Sebastian Etu and Oriel Feldman-Hall, who I guess has been around this conference a bit. So this title of this talk is Learning Moral Values, Observing Another's Desire to Punish Enhances One's Own Punitive Behavior. That's a bit of a mouthful. So hopefully I can unpack this for you. So I think many of us who study kind of social type things, right, or morality, are familiar with what you call the ultimatum game, right? And in the general setup, right, is there's a proposer who has some endowment, right, of points, right, or money. Think of these as dollars, right, and basically proposes a split with this other person called the receiver. So essentially, right, among these 10 points, right, they could elect to give some proportion of them, right, to the receiver. So just sort of more formally, right, the proposer would keep 10 minus X, right, and the receiver would get X. So obviously, whatever the receiver gets, right, the proposer doesn't get. So there's kind of the reason this is kind of interesting, right, is it provides an interesting kind of operationalization, right, of fairness versus unfairness. And so the way the ultimatum game works in the typical formulation is the subject, right, in an experiment plays the role of the receiver. And so you get some kind of offer, right, which can vary in how fair it is, right? So 5 and 5 would be your sort of classic fair offer, right? There's equality, right, or equity there if you want. And you have the decision to accept it, so you get what you were sort of proposed to receive, or you can reject it, and that means no one gets anything. And the one kind of idea, right, in people who study the ultimatum game is that rejection is bad in the sense that you get nothing, right? You should at least, there's a sense in which you should just take whatever you're offered, right? Yet people still reject unfair offers. And that's sort of thought to be a sort of punishment signal, right, to the proposer saying, that was unfair, now no one gets anything. And there's a whole bunch of interesting, actually, cross-cultural work on this, like what types of cultures are more likely to accept or reject unfair offers. So, of course, right, if you accept, you get the proposed amount, right? And if you reject, no one gets anything. So the classic kind of inequity, right? The classic kind of thing that we've seen people reject, right, is what's called disadvantageous inequity. So if someone proposes, hey, I'm going to keep $8 and give you 2, that's disadvantageous inequity, right? The receiver stands to get less than the proposer. And so there's a whole, again, this is a sort of classic case, right, of looking at rejection behavior. One thing that Oriel found in a past paper that we're sort of basing this work on, right, is people seem to be more likely to punish unfair offers on behalf of another receiver. That is, if you're watching an interaction and you get to make the call whether the offer is accepted or rejected, people will often engage in more sort of punitive behavior on behalf of another person than on behalf of themselves. And that's kind of interesting and kind of maybe sets the stage a little bit for what we want to look at here. And so in this kind of line of studies, right, one question Oriel and I had was, can people learn through exposure to others' preferences to reject disadvantageously unfair offers? So that is, if to the extent, right, that people tend to not reject unfair offers, right? They don't punish unfair behavior, right? Maybe you can sort of teach them to, and that could be a form of sort of learning a norm, right? Through, say, vicarious learning, right? Or you could call it contagion effects, things like that. So the kind of idea, right, is like observing the expression of a moral norm that is unfairness should be punished might alter how people themselves value punishment themselves. That is, when they're later asked to make a decision on their own behalf, right, will they sort of, will that kind of behavior they've observed kind of bleed into, or will it be contagious and sort of be expressed in their own punishment behavior? So the paradigm that we came up with was had these three phases. So that the baseline phase is essentially an ultimatum game with different levels of unfairness. And importantly, the subject in this experiment is deciding for the self. So you're just getting some offers, right, of various levels of fairness and unfairness. And you're sort of, and we're just asking, okay, what is this subject's baseline punishment preferences? The proposer is, so we did this study on MTurk, and we believe that these subjects believed these proposers were other sort of random people on the internet. But right, it's all, the deck was stacked. So that way we had a nice range of unfair offers. So they range from somewhat unfair, right, the 60-40 split, right, to very unfair. Then the kind of interesting thing we did here was we had subjects then assume the role of this third party that's watching interactions between a proposer and another receiver. So in this phase, right, the subject decides for the receiver, that is this offer going to be punished or not? That is this split going to be rejected or accepted? And then the kind of interesting twist was the subject receives feedback about what the receiver would have done. So in other words, you sort of mete out the punishment, right? But after that happens, this sort of fictitious receiver tells you, I would have liked to see that rejected. So in a sense, right, there's this learning of preferences that subjects could do, right? Where if they want to sort of bring their punishment preferences in line with what the receiver wants, then they can sort of use that information to incrementally update their punishment preferences. And then in this transfer phase, it was the exact same thing as the baseline phase. The participant, again, is the receiver and decides for themselves. So the question is, does exposure to this, to sort of strong preferences for punishment of unfair behavior sort of bleed into subjects' own preferences when they decide on their own behalf? So everyone gets this? All right, great, because this is the whole kind of idea. What we found briefly, right, is that people increase their endorsement of the punitive rejection option, foregoing their own monetary self-benefit, right? And what you see is that this, and this is pretty typical rejection behavior. So at baseline, people were around 27%. The rejection rates were around 27%. After seeing these kind of clear preferences on this other person's behalf, right, and doing the punishment for them, that there was a sort of contagion effect where then subjects significantly increase their punishment rates on behalf of themselves. So we take this as evidence for some kind of contagion effect, right, or some kind of vicarious learning, where having to do this on another person's behalf teaches you that you should also be punishing unfair offers, even if you stand to be, or rather, if you stand to benefit or even get punished. So so the work that Shen did that I want to talk about today expanded this a little bit. And so one kind of interesting thing, right, is there's a couple different flavors of inequity. So what we studied in this original study with Oriel was disadvantageous inequity, right? So all of the sort of unfairness was in these offers, right, was based on you getting less than the proposer. But there's another kind, right, of inequity, and that's called advantageous inequity. And so that would be like if the proposer said, hey, I'm going to keep 2 and give you 8, right? So if you're like a guilt-prone person or something, you might say, it's not, I don't like this split. Personally, I would accept all of these, but the idea, right, is people don't tend to reject these. It's very difficult to kind of observe situations where people will say, no, I don't want that. I'm going to reject this. And no one gets anything because this is unfair. It's a very high-minded kind of unfairness. And so one question, I guess the key question Shen wanted to ask in the study was, can aversion to advantageous inequity be taught similarly as we did similarly, right, with exposure to disadvantageous inequity preferences in the previous study? So that's the idea. So how can we get people to learn this? And so we expanded this paradigm a little bit, right? And there was the idea was, and there was two between subject conditions, and in these conditions, subjects see one of two types of model receivers in the learning phase. So in the control condition, we sought to replicate our previous study. And so it's helpful to visualize it this way. So these are agents, right, that subjects are exposed to in the learning phase. And here's their sort of policy, right, in terms of what types of offers what their probability of endorsing rejection of unfair or fair offers is, right? And so in this control condition, what you see is that, okay, this is the disadvantageous inequity side, right? Everything to the left of 50-50. In this condition, right, the receiver that you experience in the learning phase, right, only wants punishment for disadvantageous inequity. So this is in a sense, right, a conceptual replication of our earlier study. So it's helpful to establish that they'll learn that, right, again in this other setting. More interestingly, we came up with this, what we call the punishment condition. And this is a model receiver that punishes both types of inequity. So an extremely advantageously unfair offer like a 1090, this model receiver would be most likely to reject that, right? So there's kind of symmetric preference here, if you will. And so again, right, it was very, the setup was very similar here. So in this baseline phase, we're just collecting sort of subjects' baseline rates of rejection, right, for different types of offers stemming from disadvantageously unfair to advantageously unfair. And then we added this kind of phase, right, where they also rate the fairness of the offer they just saw. And so that might give us a kind of window, right, on what subjects think is going on with these offers. And then in the learning phase, essentially what we did was the participant, again, decides for the receiver, and then they see what they would have preferred. So here's an example. So you see this person, we hope subjects believe is a real person on the internet. They see an unfair offer get made, and then they decide whether it should be accepted or rejected, right? And then they see this feedback. Player B would have accepted that, right? So that's sort of positive feedback in a kind of reinforcement learning like framework. And again, this is just another way of view. This is just what these punishment rates look like in the two conditions, right? So the model receiver was either in this control condition that only punishes or prefers rejection of disadvantageous inequity, where in the punishment condition, they had this kind of symmetric thing where they want to see punishment of both types. And so again, then we had a transfer phase identical to the baseline phase, so we could observe the kind of shift in preferences, right, in terms of punishment on behalf of the subject. Okay, so the kind of key question, right, is do participants learn to punish unfair offers, right, measured by the difference between the baseline and transfer phase on the basis of learning about others' fairness preferences in the learning phase? So what we found, right, was, and this conceptually replicates our previous study, right, is that, okay, here's the, it's plotted a little bit differently here. Here are the baseline rejection rates, and here are the transfer rejection rates, right? And so if you see this go up, it means subjects started punishing more, right? And these are disadvantageously unequal offers. So what we see is in both conditions, right, this control condition and the punishment condition, you see an increase in punishment rates. And again, right, both conditions, right, receive the same kind of feedback from this model kind of receiver, right? So we wouldn't expect these to differ between themselves, but between the conditions, but what we would expect, right, is that their punishment rates should go up for these offer types. Importantly, right, this is kind of a useful sanity check. We look at fair 50-50 offers, right? There's no punishment of those, right? It makes sense. Everyone's happy. And we shouldn't see much change in that either, right? People don't start becoming mad about equality for some reason midway through the experiment. And then what we see, right, in the other in the advantageously unequal conditions, right, is that in the punishment condition where subjects had exposure to a model receiver that strongly disprefers advantageous inequity, we see an increase in these rejection rates for these advantageously unfair offers. So I think these effects are weaker than on the DI side, right? But at the same time, a whole bunch of literature suggests people rarely do this, right? And it's a kind of puzzle about how do we get people to do this more. We want to live in a more equal world. So the other kind of important thing here, right, is you didn't see this lift in the control condition, which makes sense, right? Because subjects never learned those kinds of preferences, right? In the learning phase, right? Those model players they saw did not have preferences for punishment of these offer types. So that's interesting, I think. We could also look at fairness ratings, right? So after these different types of offers, right, when subjects chose on their own behalf, they were asked to say, how unfair was this proposal in general? And so another thing we'd ask is, was there learning as evidenced by these fairness ratings, right? Which would suggest that they're doing it, their change in punishment behavior, right, has something to do with their perception that these offers are unfair. And so here these fairness ratings plotted the same way. So lower means more unfair, right? Or higher means more fair. These kind of move down over time. Not a whole bunch. I think the idea is that in disadvantageous inequality, subjects already kind of believe these are unfair. What we do see is this kind of change, right, in the punishment condition, in fairness ratings, right? So they start to learn, I think this data suggests, that these sort of advantageously unequal offers are also unfair, right? So the sort of change in ratings mirrors the change in punishment preferences. So we think that's interesting. Right, same slide here. The other thing we could look at, right, and this is where this connects to RL a little bit more, is learning phase behavior, right? So you can, so subjects got many trials, right, of different offer types on behalf of this kind of model player, right? And so if we look at these kind of learning curves, right, like rejection rates over time, what we could ask is, okay, does the learning phase behavior suggest that subjects learn these preferences in a kind of incremental trial by trial fashion? So here are the learning curves for the control condition, right? And what you see is in these in these offer types for which punishment rate was strongly reinforced, right, by virtue of the receiver's stated preferences, right? You see that the rejection rates go up over time. Importantly, right, there's nothing to really learn in for example, the fair offers, right, or the advantageously unequal offers, right, because there was no sort of systematic reinforcement given for these for rejecting these offers. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this figure could be better. So these are all these offer types in the learning phase were sort of interleaved. And so what we're doing is we're just saying, okay, let's just look at, for example, these highly unfair offers and what the kind of change in rejection behavior over time is. Does that help answer your question? Okay, and then what we see, right, and this is expected, right, is that in the advantageous inequality, or sorry, in the punishment condition, right, we start seeing these learning curves emerge for punishment of advantageously unequal offers, right? And that's to be expected, right, in the sense that these were the ones that were reinforced. So I think this is, again, a kind of nice sanity check, right? These people in the control condition shouldn't be learning anything, whereas you should see some kind of signs of learning in the punishment condition. Just really briefly, one kind of intuition we had was that learning phase behavior, that is just changes between the beginning and the end of the learning phase, might have some predictive bearing, right, on contagion, that is the difference in preferences in the baseline and transfer phase, right, when subjects were deciding on their own behalf. And what we see is in most conditions in the kind of expected places, there's a predictive relationship between learning phase behavioral change and this sort of index of contagion vis-a-vis the transfer scores. And so Another thing Shen wanted to do was if we have this kind of behavior, right, that looks like incremental learning, this sort of thing, right, is amenable to sort of trial by trial models of learning. And maybe you can see where this is going because this is an RL meeting. One thing we do, right, is ask, okay, maybe we could construct some different types of models which make different assumptions about how these preferences are learned. And then maybe these kind of model fits would tell us something interesting, right, about what sort of learning is underpinning at least learning phase behavior. So one candidate model, right, is just simple kind of vanilla RL, as we call it. So what this model is doing, right, is just learning a simple policy mapping different offer types to actions, right? So what this policy would sort of learn, right, is that, okay, if I get this moderately unfair offer, I'm most likely to reject it, right? So you could think of this as just a kind of table of Q values, right, mapping where there's Q values for different offer types, right? And those values are learned on the basis of the receiver's feedback. And so that's the kind of, I guess, most simplistic possible like account of this. But it stands to reason, right, that subjects might be doing something more sophisticated and actually making some inferences about what is the receiver like as a person, if you will. And so there's a fairly well-known kind of simple model of unfairness or utility of fairness, but the Fair-Schmidt model. It's always weird to me that the person best known for studying fairness is named Fair. If you need a panel topic, you could go with that. So that the idea with the classic Fair-Schmidt inequity function is that receivers' preferences, right, are governed by a utility function. And so in Fair-Schmidt, and this is the kind of classic formulation, the utility, right, of accepting an offer is kind of modulated by these two parameters, right? So you have the offer content here, but then you have these two parameters, right, that govern how much disutility you get from the two different kinds of inequity. So your alpha parameter here, you can call the envy parameter, right? That sort of scales or weights how much disadvantageous inequity contributes to the disutility of this offer. And of course, the presumption is that something that has a lot of disutility will be unlikely to be chosen, right, by an agent using these kind of Fair-Schmidt preferences. And then you have this beta parameter, which we call guilt. That's this parameter that kind of weights the contribution of advantageous inequity, right? So to the extent that you don't like getting more than other people, right, a larger beta parameter will sort of characterize how much you don't like that, how much that contributes to the overall disutility of the offer. And so just some simplifying assumptions here, right? We assume the disutility, or rather the utility of rejecting an offer is always zero, right? Because you get nothing. So the real question is, how bad does it make you feel? What the Fair-Schmidt utility function kind of says is, how bad does it make you feel to accept this offer, right? And if it turns out that this is less than zero, right, then you would predict, right, a Fair-Schmidt governed agent should reject the offer. So the sort of simplest formulation of this we call the static Fair-Schmidt model. So essentially, there's what we're trying to fit as free parameters is the alpha and the beta parameter for the model player. Of course, it would be weird to assume this was static, right? If what subjects are doing the learning phase is trying to learn the preferences or the utilities governing the preferences of the model player. So Shen developed this model we call the Fair-Schmidt inference model. I won't go into the details here because it's just a lot of boring equations, but I'm happy to send you a paper or something. What we do is we assume the subject infers the parameters of the Fair-Schmidt utility function. So again, what the player is doing in the learning phase is figuring out what alpha is and what beta is for this model player. And then it can use those, right, to essentially inform choices to reject or accept offers, because you want to make the model player happy. You want to reduce their disutility. So doing a kind of model comparison and penalizing for complexity with the AIC, what we find, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the Fair-Schmidt inference model best fit the learning phase behavior. So lower scores are better here. What we see here is actually the RL model that's just learning this simple mapping of offer types to rejection rates is doing a terrible job of accounting for the choice behavior in comparison to, for example, to these two Fair-Schmidt models. So the static model, importantly, a bit worse than the inference model, which would make sense, right? If what we're saying is subjects are not only assuming this preference function, but learning the parameters governing it. So just one kind of interesting thing this Fair-Schmidt inference model lets you do is look under the hood and say, okay, what would we assume in the course of the learning phase subjects would be learning about envy and guilt, so these alpha and beta parameters. And what we see, right, this is just simulating the model based on the best fit parameters, is that over time, right, at least in the punishment condition, the model would predict that this guilt parameter is increasing. That is, in order to account, right, or in order to explain the model player's preferences, right, there must be some kind of aversion, right, or disutility to advantageous inequity. And so that has to go up over time, right, to kind of explain the model player's behavior. So right, that's the first experiment. The second experiment was just a subtle kind of twist on the first. So we have this model comparison result, right, that suggests that subjects are doing something akin to inferring the preferences of the model player, right? They're not just learning this in a kind of stimulus response, simple RL-like way. And so if that's true, right, if subjects are indeed learning these latent preferences of the receiver, we would expect that feedback-driven learning, right, of the target, right, or the receiver's punishment preferences should generalize, right, across offer types. So the intuition here, right, is if we only reinforce one offer, if we only reinforce one offer type here, that is, if only the 30-70 offers, right, which are advantageously unequal, are reinforced, right, with punishment preferences, we should see that subjects should generalize this to other similar contexts. That is, in the case of this highly unfair offer, right, if what the subject did was actually infer some kind of underlying preference function, then it should be easy to also infer, right, that, oh, I also want to reject 1090 offers, right? And importantly, no feedback was given for these. So this is a kind of stringent test, right, of generalization. So, and I think the kind of second order question here is, does this learning in turn transfer to participants' own fairness preferences, right? Again, through this kind of contagion measure. And importantly, right, this is really brief, right? What we find is, okay, we replicate the sort of standard stuff we find with learning to punish disadvantageous inequity. What we see here is that there's a positive kind of there's a positive change, right, in rejection rates for these highly unfair, advantageously unequal offers, right, where no training was given, right? So subjects never saw that they should be rejecting 1090 offers, but on the basis of only learning about these less unfair offers, right, they're sort of generalizing and saying, okay, now I get the idea, like, unfairness is bad, so I should be more likely to reject these highly unfair DI offers. So I think that's a nice kind of follow-up test, right, suggesting that they are learning something about an underlying preference function. So that's it. So in conclusion, right, I think what we've demonstrated is that exposure to individuals who strongly prefer punishment of both disadvantageous and advantageous inequality resulted in a boost of social norm enforcement behaviors, and this was made on the subject's own behalf. And so there's this kind of idea, right, that rejecting these unequal offers, right, could be a social signal, right, like a form of norm enforcement. Like, hey, I'm going to punish both of us to make sure you don't propose something this unfair again. And I think, I hope I've demonstrated that the acquisition of others' preferences is seems to be contingent, right, on something, on incremental learning from social feedback, and looks like it's dependent on mechanisms akin to those deployed in this kind of trial and error learning. This shouldn't say basic RL because that was the worst model, but you get the idea. So I think we have some time for questions here before I have to go. So thanks to Shen for doing all the work, and my collaborators, Oriel and Sebastian.
Thanks, Ross. That was awesome. Any questions, Eugene?
Thank you for the talk. That was great. I was wondering if you, in the disadvantaged inequity case, you can make the curves go the other way by inducing them to accept more often than they reject, and whether you've looked into it or thought about that.
No, we haven't thought about that. That would be kind of interesting. So because it's in a sense like selfish, where you can construct like a sort of argument, right? That maybe it would be even more high-minded to just accept things that are unfair for you. That'd be a cool follow-up. And I think like within this paradigm, like that would be a sort of simple change to make. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the talk.
Hey, thanks for that really interesting stuff. Towards the end where you showed that like if the 30-70 split or 70-30 split were considered to be rejected, then you could show kind of a zero shot transfer to the 90-10. Did you guys consider like that kind of assumes that the agent, like player B, is kind of acting rationally in that like they wouldn't just all of a sudden accept a 90-10 if they were rejecting 70-30, but they could, I guess, kind of, it wouldn't make sense in this context, but be acting strategically to try and make player A maybe change their policy. So have you thought about like what would happen, or would there be any surprise on behalf of the human if player B kind of didn't act very sensically like that?
Oh, like if they were inconsistent or something?
If they were inconsistent, yeah. And then also like they would reject 70-30, but then accept 90-10.
Oh, that'd be interesting. So what?
To try and influence
Right.
what player A's policy was.
Yeah, that would be kind of an interesting twist to do. So in other words, the idea would be, for example, if you reinforced the 90-10, but actually provided the opposite kind of feedback for the 70-30.
Yeah. So in like the ultimatum game, it wouldn't really make sense, but it might in other contexts kind of, I think, would be interesting to look at if player B was trying to be strategic.
Right. Yeah, and like a big part of this is we're trying to make subjects think that these aren't sophisticated or strategic players they're watching. Like, but yeah, I mean, I think things would get a little bit more complicated, right? If you consider this kind of second order strategy thing, where it's like, what is this person signaling or trying to get player A to do?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's some interesting possibilities that we can consider these kind of more strategic elements of these interactions.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for a great talk. Sorry, I missed a few of it. And also I'm working on a project very closely related to Fred Schmidt model. So I'd love to talk to you offline, some more questions. I have a more general question, which I've been thinking about, inspired by a lot of talks in this conference, is how do our research on people's decision-making under the influence of various kinds of norm, for example, inequity aversion here, and how would those research inform like the AI research in building better coordination between machine and people? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I guess it sort of suggests that there are things that could be learned, right? Like if you imagine an agent doesn't have a strong idea of what fairness is, right? It's not sort of hard coded or given to it as a sort of prior. Maybe it suggests there's, taking a framework like Fair Schmidt or something. You can use those to basically put an agent in an environment where it doesn't know what people consider fair or unfair, and through some process like in this model, just use basically use the observational knowledge, right, to then get some idea of, okay, this is what makes people mad, like this is what people consider unfair. But I think the Fair Schmidt is a sort of useful general purpose framework, right? Sort of, at least in the context of the ultimatum game, I think things get much more complicated. Right? It moves to other paradigms.
Sorry, I didn't see which one you raised your hands first.
Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. Have you considered situations with more than 2 individuals, so 3 individuals, where you're trying to balance fairness between 3 individuals?
Kind of like
Extending the minigame, and I'm guessing, I'm just curious off the top of your head, what kind of complications would be involved with that type of extension?
Yeah, I mean, things get really complicated fast. I mean, part of the beauty of the ultimatum game is that it's almost as simple as it gets, and 2, right? It's kind of, I think many disciplines sort of agree it's like a useful operationalization of fairness or unfairness. So I'm a little bit, I guess, reluctant to try to add more complication. Also, like, viewers tend to get cranky when you go kind of off script. But I think this is a very sort of simple and maybe impoverished form, right, of unfairness. But I think maybe what you're alluding to, right, is in situations where there's more parties, there's more sort of complex types of unfair behavior, right? That the ultimatum game, right, doesn't really let you operationalize or address.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take this one last question while Guillaume sets up the recording from Natasha.
When you try and influence a worker's preferences by having them watch someone else give preferences, what context do you provide them? Do you tell them like this is an expert negotiator or this is a layman?
So yeah, sorry. So the what we tried to do is so that they're all people on MTurk. They think this is just like another person playing the same game at the same time. So we showed them like a fake Turker ID, and we're like, these are just regular people. So I mean, maybe what you're hinting at is that people would sort of learn or respond differently if they made more sort of specific assumptions about what those perceived model players were like this person's an ethicist, or like this person's in jail or something. Yeah, I think that'd be an interesting twist. I mean, another kind of thing we've thought about is, what happens if what we did in Chen's experiments is that it was different players each time. So we're like, what our assumption is that people are learning some kind of population level preference, right? But you can imagine playing with that level of kind of heterogeneity, where it's like some of the people don't care, for example, about certain types of inequity, and others do. But yeah, I'd be happy to hear more suggestions.
All right, thanks.
All right, thanks, Ross.
Thanks again, Ross.